So my name is Joost Pauwelyn. I'm a professor of international law here at the Graduate Institute, and also the strategic director of the Geneva Trade Platform, one of the three co-organizers of the event, together with the law firm of CLK Europe and AEGIS Europe, which is a trade association. There's been a lot of CBAM events as of late, a lot of CBAM discussions. I think this one is somewhat different, or I hope we can shed a different light on the issue in three ways. And this is really trying to summarize why we are holding this event. The first thing, and we want to focus on this, is given that CBAM has been in operation now, we've had 2 reporting cycles already. No one has paid any money under CBAM. This only will happen as of 2026. But we have some experience now. I've been thinking, writing, talking about border adjustment for 15 years. And now finally we have a measure in place, and we have some evidence already as to how companies, importers, producers have reacted. And this is why I'm really excited to have Vicente with us, who comes from the European Commission and who will talk to us about the actual operation of CBAM. Now, the second angle we want to highlight is not so much the details of CBAM, but how other countries have reacted against or reacted to CBAM or replicated CBAM. And for that, we have Chantal-Line Carpentier of UNCTAD. UNCTAD, who together with the WTO and the IMF, the World Bank, and OECD, issued very recently a report on carbon pricing. And of course, CBAM is just one element of this. So CBAM in operation, CBAM and how other countries have reacted to it. And thirdly, and for me, also incredibly interesting, is to hear an industry perspective on CBAM. And here in Geneva, we often hear, and rightly so, about how it is difficult for importers, for producers in developing countries to comply with CBAM. What we do not very often hear is, what is it that EU industry thinks about CBAM? And very often in Geneva, we think CBAM is some kind of hidden green protectionism to favor EU industry. But it's more complicated than that. EU industry as well is struggling with CBAM and has real issues with it. And I think it's really interesting to hear their perspective. Also for other countries to learn from this. So without further ado, I want to introduce, and I've kind of already done so partly, our 3 speakers. So first will be Vicente Hurtado Roa, who comes from the EU Commission. And as you may know, CBAM is not under DG Trade, but it's under the Director General for Taxation and Customs Union, DG TAXUD, as they call it. And Vicente is the head of unit there of the CBAM Energy and Green Taxation. Okay, so really delighted to have you here in person. Fantastic you could be here. Dr. Chantal-Line Carpentier is the head Trade, Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at UNCTAD. And before that, she was the chief of the New York office of UNCTAD. And before that, which I thought was interesting, she's also worked as head Environment, Economy and Trade Division of the North American Free Trade Agreement Commission on Environmental Cooperation. Our third speaker is not with us in person, but will be representing that EU industry voice. Inès van Lierde is the co-chair of AEGIS Europe. And AEGIS Europe is one of the co-organizers. AEGIS is an industry alliance representing more than 20 industries, aiming to promote manufacturing, investment, innovation, jobs, and growth in Europe. And Inès has been working in the field of trade defense, commercial policy, energy, climate issues for almost 40 years in the private sector and also in the EU Commission before that. She will be presenting together with Renaud Batier, who is the other co-chair of AEGIS Europe. And Renaud is also the Director General of CERAM Unie since 2008. I'll give the floor first to Vicente, and I've asked all 3 of the speakers to try and stick to 13 minutes. so we have enough time for discussion. Vicente, great to hear you.
Sure, thank you. It's going to be a challenge for me. As you will see, I speak a lot and very quickly, as good Spaniard, but I will try to limit myself to the 30 minutes. And first of all, I'm very happy to be here today. I think it's important for us that we are able to explain better the CBAM. As Joost was saying, and I'm happy to see his excitement, and I hope I will also keep the excitement among the audience on the subject, but I will not explain what CBAM is. I think that at this stage, everybody knows and understands what CBAM is. Maybe what is more interesting for you is to understand how we see CBAM implementation, what we are doing, and more importantly, what we are going to do from now until the end of the transitional period, which will be at the end of 2025. So time is ticking because, as you know, and Josh was mentioning, nobody has paid CBAM so far because the financial obligations with CBAM will only start in January 2026, but we started already with the transitional period last October or October last year. So now we have 1 year of experience, and I think it would be important that we share with you some of this experience. I have prepared 4 slides or 5 slides. The first slide is about the gradual implementation of the CBAM. First of all, of course, because as I said before, we have a transitional period, which is already going on. And then, of course, from 2026, where there will be obligations, financial obligations, these financial obligations will also be gradually kicked in as, for example, or precisely, the free allowances under the EU ETS will be also phased out. I think that that's something that it's already well known, but I wanted to underline that because of that, from 26 to 2034, the introduction of CBAM will also be gradual. So we cannot expect that all the impact of the CBAM will be felt already in 2026, because the free allowances will be phased out only slowly, but we can expect that only by 2030, and of course by 2034, completely, the impact of the CBAM will really be felt. So what are we doing during the transitional period? We are collecting data. That's very important for us because we want to analyze the system. The transitional period was meant for everyone to learn, for the Commission or the European Union to understand how carbon pricing and monitoring and reporting verification systems operate in third countries, and also for us to understand the impact on CBAM on the EU industry. And thank you, Joost, that you mentioned that, because we very often forget, not us, but outside the EU, we forget about the impact of the CBAM on the EU industry because of what I explained before, because of the free allowances, which will be phased out from 2026. But of course, we also want to analyze, or I think it's important, this transitional period for stakeholders, importers in the EU, who will be the ones applying the CBAM, but also producers in the countries, and also for governments in the countries if they want to introduce carbon pricing. The transitional period will be a right moment and the sufficient time to get ready. What we are doing now is, of course, analyzing the data that we are collecting on a quarterly basis. We already have had 4 reporting periods. The first, for the last quarter of 2023, and now already for the first 3 quarters of 2024. The last reporting period was last October, which is also an important one, and I will refer to that later on. And we are analyzing that data. We are also finalizing many implementing and delegated acts in order to fine-tune the system and in order to come with all the details for the implementation of the system from 2026. And we are also analyzing the impact, in particular on third countries, on EU industry, but also on producers in third countries, with a special focus on least developed countries. We will come with a report by the middle of 2025, no precise date, I would say more July than June or than May, but the idea is that by the middle of 2025, we will come with a report. In the report, we are obliged, because this obligation of the report comes from the Parliament, from the European Parliament and the Council, we will analyze all these impacts that I mentioned before, but also the possibility of extending in the future, and let's not panic, in the future, by 2030 at the latest, the possibility of extending the scope of the measure also to other EU ETS sectors, never sectors which are not in the EU ETS. I get many questions about textiles, agriculture products. They are not in the ETS. They will not be part of the CBAM. And also, for example, in terms of emissions, indirect emissions from the production of electricity, some precursors. I mean, I know that becomes technical, but I think it's important to understand that we are analyzing that. We will also analyze the governance system of the CBAM. As you possibly know, the governance is shared between the EU or the Commission and member states, the 27 member states of the EU. That's less relevant for you, I guess, but that's important also to be analyzed. And of course, I mentioned the impact on the EU industry, and in particular, the question of the free allowances and also the impact on exports. As you know, one of the objectives with the introduction of the CBAM is to avoid the risk of carbon leakage. As we increase our ambition, there are more and more possibilities for leakage, carbon leakage to third countries, which have lenient climate policies or more lenient climate policies. And the introduction of CBAM is a measure on the imports that tries, as you know, to apply equivalent measures to those goods produced in the EU with goods produced in third countries. And then, of course, the idea also is to analyze what will be the impact on the exports. Moving to the next slide. The transitional period has already provided some interesting data. I will tell you, and I will have to go quickly, but then, of course, during the discussion, I can be more precise. We are realizing, first of all, that in the first year of operations, most of the importations are concentrated on a small number of producers. So we are realizing that, I will give you some figures. The figures are, of course, only initial figures, but around 80% of the importations in terms of volume, in terms of CO2 emissions, are done by less than 20% of all the importers. So there is a great concentration, of course, of the volume of importation on a small number of importers. One of the concerns that we hear very often is that CBAM brings administrative burden, CBAM brings complexity. What are you going to do? We are analyzing that. That's one of the things that we are of course, analyzing. Another thing which is also important to say is, for example, in terms of default values and actual emissions, I mentioned before that this reporting period in October was important, and it's important because the obligation to use actual emissions kicks in. Until now, we allow the possibility to use default values that we have published. Now, with some flexibility, when the data cannot be collected, importers need to report based on actual emissions because we need the data. That's the only explanation. It's not because we want to sneak. It's because we want to get the data in order to do a good analysis. Now, what I can say is that around 50% of the declarations that we are receiving now are made or using actual emissions. In terms of entries, the percentage is much lower, but when you look, for example, at the top importers, I mean, at the higher values of importations, what I can say is that we are reaching even higher values. For example, in the case of the cement sector, which is the one which uses more actual emissions than default values, we are around 80% or even above 80%. So I think that that's data that we are collecting now that is being very helpful. I cannot say much more about carbon intensities in third countries, about carbon pricing, because as I was saying, most of the imports were still using default values instead of actual emissions. But of course, that's something that we want to analyze. And as you possibly know, we will publish again a new list of default values by the end of next year. It will be good by good, CN code by CN code, country by country, with a sort of carbon intensity average for that good in that country. In the definitive regime, importers will be able to use actual emissions. That's the idea, but whenever there is no possibility to use it, they can always use the default values. Moving next to the next slides, just to give you an indication of what are the implementing the delegated acts that we are preparing. So not only the report and the analysis that I mentioned before, but we are also working on a number of delegated and implementing acts. Next slide. Thank you. We published last week 2 draft implementing regulations in our portal, Have Your Say. So it's a public consultation to get your feedback. So if you are interested, please go and try to provide your feedback. These are very technical on the registry, which will be used for the definitive period, but also on the authorizations. But what can be more interesting for you are the other ones for basically Q3 2025 on calculation of emissions. So the methodology, the new methodology or the final methodology for declaring emissions under the CBAM, and then verification of the emissions. As you know, there is no obligation of verification in the transitional period. That will come also in 2026. And also the carbon pricing, that will come a bit later. So these ones, if you are interested in CBAM and in giving your feedback, please stay tuned, as people say, and then provide your feedback, because I think that will be very, very useful and helpful for us. We have launched a number of studies. Those studies are going to help us to analyze all this, not only these issues I mentioned, but also we are producing the benchmarks for every good. You remember what I said about the free allowances being phased out? Of course, the levels of those benchmarks for the free allowances will also be recognized for the imported goods. So in 2026, if you are producing in India steel, which is less intensive in carbon emissions than the benchmark that we have in 2026 in the EU for the EU producers, you will not pay any CBAM. This is why I also mentioned that the introduction will be gradual. So those benchmarks will be published by the end of next year, and then every year, and the benchmarks will be good per good, and that will give an indication of, okay, this is the carbon intensity which is exempted, let's call it like that. Only if I have a higher intensity, then there will have to be an adjustment based on the difference. On the next slide, I wanted to summarize the challenges. Of course, compliance is a challenge. It's a challenge for us, not such a big issue for you. The complementarity, of course, with other international measures, and we will hear afterwards about the report, for example, of the some international organizations, about BCAs, about carbon pricing, but OECD, Climate Club are very active on metrics, for example. There are other countries which are announcing CBAMs, like the UK. Last week, they published their reaction to the consultation, but also Australia, Canada, Taiwan, other countries are considering. And I'm sure that there will be more and more countries interested as they are increasing their level of ambition. So we want to learn from all of these experiences, of course. And just to be clear, we are open to initiatives at international level to have some sort of common carbon price or introduction of carbon price. But the problem is that as long as we are not there, we have an issue. And then, of course, the question of the administrative burden and the question of the external dimension of the carbon leakage that I mentioned before, and which is very relevant, of course, for the EU industry. All this will feed into the review of next year and possibly into an amendment to the CBAM regulation to take into account. And just the last slide on reducing the administrative burden is not that I think that this dog represents the CBAM. Let's be clear. But I thought it was very graphic.
It's not a British bulldog.
It's a bulldog. It's a bulldog, even worse. And I'm not the doctors. We are not the doctors. We are not healing anyone. But okay, we are trying to contribute to the greening of this planet, also with the CBAM. Believe it or not, I'm convinced of that. But of course, the administrative burden, the simplification is something which is important. I mentioned before the facts. Small number of importers concentrate high number of CO2 emissions and importations. We are analyzing that, and I can tell you that we will come. I cannot tell you what exactly because we are still discussing internally, but we will come with simplifications, which will solve many problems. Problems for small importers, problems for small exporters, problems with metrics, and problems with verification. But that's something that will come. And if you want to know more, you will have to stay tuned in, as I said before. And I think you will know more at the beginning of next year. And I will know more. And then you will know more. Thank you, Joost. I'm sure that I took more than 17 minutes.
No, you're perfectly
surprised. Yes. I'm surprised.
Thanks a lot. And really interesting, very positive, very encouraging data. I'm sure that any objections from UNCTAD to CBAM are hereby lifted, and the EU industry is happier than ever. No, but I think it's really interesting to hear, because as you said, for so many years, people were saying, you can't do this. It's impossible practically. And of course, it's not perfect yet, but it's happening. And very encouraging that you have actual emissions already for 50% of reporters. Chantal-Line, I know this is a difficult task, a long report, but how would you summarize
the report? Yep.
Other countries' reactions to this?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And to clarify, UNCTAD does not have a position on CBAM. Actually, we feel that there's lack of evidence. So congratulations, Vicente, on actually doing the hard work and gathering the data, because we believe that the decision needs to be evidence-based. And so far, all we can rely on is ex-ante analysis that are modeled, and there's very few ex-post analysis. So your analysis would be extremely helpful. Having said that, we were asked by Ngozi at the World Trade Organization, us, the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, to basically come together as international organization to look at this issue of carbon pricing, climate ambition, and border carbon adjustment, CBAM only being one of them. And we don't single out the CBAM at all because it's more of the general issue. So basically what we're trying to do, starting with the basis that at the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, countries have the freedom to decide on their nationally determined contribution, how they're going to, what level of ambition they're going to have, and how they're going to achieve those through their policies. And it's a bottom up, and therefore, because it's bottom up, it means that it will be divergent across countries because they're divergent circumstances and level of development. And basically, what does that imply for the global greenhouse gases? Well, there's political feasibility and distributional concern of these policies. And of course, what I think you didn't mention explicitly, but it was very implicit, is the cross-border spillover effect and the potential trade tensions that will result from those border carbon adjustment. And what we try to do is for contribution, and I'll focus today on, of course, the cross-border one, but we look at the common understanding of carbon pricing metrics, because basically there are three of the authors have three different ways of measuring the carbon pricing, so it can be very confusing for everybody. So at least to get a sense of what the difference between each of them is a value added, we felt. The second one is the analysis of the appropriate mix of climate change mitigation policies that should be used. And there what we find, and it's mostly based on the OECD data, because of course developed countries were ahead, is that they tend to use regulation, subsidies, incentive, and then they move on to the carbon pricing, in part because of the learning experience. Second, because it's more politically feasible, because the tax is more visible to consumers, and therefore you can object more directly, but also the industry tend to also have concern with competitiveness. And so, but that has an implication for UNCTAD for a developing country perspective, because if we are asking developing countries to put a carbon tax now, are we basically having them jump forward a few decades of what our countries have been able to experience? So that's a question mark, right? The third point is the coordination of policies to maximize positive and limit spillover effect. That's what we're going to focus on today. And then we basically conclude the report by saying, what is it that international organizations like us can do to support member states? We can help on cooperation and we can help on coordination. And the coordination quickly, because it feeds very well on what Vicente mentioned, is that once the CBAM is out and once the UK border carbon adjustment will come in, which will have different products, different reporting requirement, different, and then the Canadian one and the Australian one and the Taiwan one. You can imagine now this is more than a spaghetti bowl. I don't know what it is, but it's a puzzle with 1,000 pieces that people have to deal with. So coordination is definitely needed. We had, incidentally, a call with the UN climate envoy yesterday, the co-authors of this report, to discuss with Selwyn Hart the outcome of this report, which, by the way, sorry, but I have to say this because we suffered so much to this report. He thought it was excellent. And he wanted to see how, one, what's the common message that the Secretary General could amplify? Second, how can the international organization come together to jointly provide technical cooperation to member states? Because many of them, and including the G20 plus, like the 35 countries that represent 85% of the greenhouse gases emission, many of them have actually asked us for support in putting in place a carbon pricing. So that is to say, those larger emitter know that they probably need, it's part of their toolbox to put a carbon price, but will need support. How do we support them? And one proposal could be something like what we did for the panel on critical mineral of the Secretary General. So adding some sort of coordination so we don't wait to have a mix of things. And the third one was, well, that was the third one, the cross-border, the coordination of these issues. So quickly, of course, what we go through is the menu of policy tool that exists. And the bottom line is, if there was only one market externality, right? One on price externality, which would be carbon, then carbon price would be the optimal tool. Problem is we have several externalities at the same time, and we're trying to fight inequalities, and we're trying to achieve the SDGs, and we're trying to achieve several of the goals. And in that context, one solution is probably not the optimal fix for 5 or 6 problems. Therefore, there will always be probably a mix of policy that will be needed. And it will differ by country. And however, as I mentioned, for many of the larger and the most advanced economy, carbon pricing will probably be part of it, in part because there's a revenue attached to it. And with that revenue can help finance some of the investment in renewable energy and decarbonization that are needed to mitigate the impact on export and GDP. And of course, we focus a lot, I don't add on the just transition aspect, and the international cooperation that would be needed. In section 4 of the report, this is where we talk about the spillover effect of the climate policies. And some of the part are very theoretical, but we felt it was important to go into theory. And then we basically go into example with evidence. But on these, there's 5 types of cross-border spillovers, and some of them are positive, right? You can imagine already, the World Bank says that because of the CBAM, several countries are considering having a carbon price. It will also stimulate investment in renewable energy, green technologies, and others, presumably, for those that can afford it. And basically also, it would also reduce demand for fossil fuel. That could be positive or negative, because if you're a developing country that depend heavily on one commodity, which is fossil fuel export, this is not a positive for you, because you need a transition, and you're going to need a different plan to transition out of this. And also it will reduce, because fossil fuel represent a high part of our trade right now. The trade to GDP ratio, which is already decreasing for several other reasons, will be decreasing furthermore. And so that changed the whole trade landscape, if you want. And then there's potential security effect of climate policy. So because energy is so important for national policies, several countries are using local content and other measures to basically justify those policies. And then, of course, we look at the cost increasing and cost reducing. I'm not going to go into cost reducing, but you can imagine the IRA as a cost reducing, so the subsidy side of things, while what we're focusing here on the border carbon adjustment are more the cost increasing policies. And in a sense, what they do, it's not a producer one, it's a consumer one, because it imposes a higher cost on domestic and foreign producers, and therefore consumers as well. So we distinguish between the two. Of course, it changed in relative competitiveness, otherwise there would be no need for border carbon adjustment. And it should be limiting emission and reward ambitions firm. But as you mentioned, Vicente, the huge compliance costs can be a lot for a lot of these countries. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have ex-ante models that predict a range from anywhere to 5 to 60% of leakages. UNCTAD predicted 17% for the CBAM originally, but it's all over the place. The ex-post analysis are even wider, and some of them have negative impact and some of them have positive impact. So basically we are in the unknown, and this is why we need evidence. And so, and then of course, high compliance, there's no doubt there, that's a certainty. And then of course, it's gonna affect a higher relative emission intensity, and countries like developing countries with lower access to technology, green technology, or a less of a green grid will also be affected the most because it's embodied carbon. And so the design of this, I've seen it. The design of the border carbon adjustment will be primordial. And what we're saying is that These border carbon adjustment as principle should maximize the greenhouse gas effect reduction while minimizing spillover effect on third countries, especially, as you mentioned, LDCs, but also the SIDS that are highly impacted and other fiscally constrained countries that basically after the COVID basically spend more on health or education, more on servicing their debt than on health and education. How in that context are they supposed to invest in decarbonizing? So they need our help, right? So this is pretty much what I wanted to say. And I think I have a few minutes left.
Yes.
And I hope it's going to generate some discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are moving now because there's a lot, and we can come back to many of these issues. We are moving now, hopefully seamlessly to Inès.
Thank you very much. So, yes, I will start with a quick presentation of AEGIS Europe, who we are, as we are co-organizers of this event. And so I don't think I can change the slide, so I will, yes, thank you. This is a short outline of what I will be saying. The two co-chairs, so Renaud and I will go through this presentation. So first, a quick introduction about who we are and what we do, and our position on CBAM, and also some industry's experience during the transitional phase, and then, of course, our concerns and recommendation as an industry. So we can start, please. Yes, so AEGIS Europe, which is one of the co-organizers of today's event, is an alliance of sectors, industrial sectors. We are now more than 20, and there are more applications in the pipeline. So maybe by the end of the year, we will reach a number of 25 sectors. We are extremely representative of the value chain because we have upstream segments represented, but also downstream. And in terms of economic weight, we are quite representative, as altogether we represent something like 500 billion euros in annual turnover, and of course millions of jobs. On screen you can see all the logos of the members which have applied so far. And as I said, we keep growing, and this is good news. We can go to the next one, please. Yes, our goals. In fact, we have started to work some years ago, more than 10 years ago now. And in fact, we joined forces because as fundamentally a trade organization, what is our priority is to ensure that our members compete on a level playing field, that there is fair international competition going on. And so I would say that our slogan is first, fair trade, and then free trade, but fair is really a must. And so through this slogan, of course, our mandate is to promote manufacturing investment, employment growth in Europe, but also, and I would say most members in AEGIS Europe are using the trade defense instruments, not because we are protectionists, certainly not, but because we believe that these instruments are there to restore fair competition and restore a level playing field. We also advocate fiercely against distortions, against state-run or other non-market practices which have a permanent disruptive effect on the market. The next, please. Yes, as I said, we advocate fair trade, fair competition, and we are obviously a lobby organization based in Brussels. And so to give you just an example of what we are doing, last July, we have organized an event where, in fact, we had more than 20 CEOs representing a variety of different sectors taking the floor, all of them being extremely worried by, let's say, the situation on the market in terms of investments, in terms of distortions of exchanges, and so on. And so there was also a big focus on overcapacities. But last but not least, CBAM was also part of our discussion because, of course, even if we all know that CBAM is not a trade measure, but it has obviously an impact on trade. So we can go to the next one, please. Yes, in terms of structure, it's, as I said, it is an alliance, but we have grown. And over the last 10 to 12 years, we have been setting up several working groups, and they are there on screen. So those which meet more often are those what we call the topical working groups. And in red, you can see that CBAM is an important working group between the others. And I know that in the room today, Bernard Lombard is attending physically, and he's the one who is very successfully leading our CBAM task force. So next, please. Yes, the AEGIS position, global position on CBAM is that, well, it's not a surprise as AEGIS Europe, as an industry, I would say even as a citizen, we are extremely supportive of the EU Green Deal and the climate neutrality objective. So fundamentally, we recognize that there are lots of merits to have put the CBAM into place, but, and there are many buts. First, the CBAM must work and must work efficiently and delivering on the overarching the climate goals. So we believe that as an instrument, CBAM has a lot of value, but Renaud will go through our asks and concerns based already on the practice that we have as an industry, where we find that there are a series of loopholes. And so please, Renaud, I give you the floor for the next slide.
Thank you. I think everyone can hear me. Yep. So thank you very much. I will continue. Thank you very much for hosting us, and we are sorry, I think both Inès and myself not being in Geneva today. I appreciated the input given by Vicente Hurtado. What we are giving is, of course, not taking into account new developments, but it's based on the feedback that we received from our members, either those that are in the scope or some that are in the scope that are importing precursors, for example, and raw materials. So you will see that a lot of these comments are also reflected to some extent in the report of Mr. Draghi. One of them was the heavy administrative work. So he was calling for simplification. He was stressing this point. And on our side, this is also what we received as an input. But the administrative burden can be very high. It's not only for SMEs, it's also for large companies. And we know of companies that are not in the scope, but are only importing some materials and have had to recruit people just to manage the administrative burden. So, of course, I was interested by the comment from Vicente Hurtado on this point, because you mentioned that it was 80% covering, 80% would be covered by a few importers, but I suppose that maybe the 20% are really spread among many, many small, but that's something that we should discuss. The feedback that we are receiving is that there are many entities that have to cope with a high administrative burden, especially in the case of low-value shipments of those goods with very low embedded emissions. And of course, for SMEs, it is extremely complex. Then the difficulty is to get accurate emissions from data suppliers. There, it's not only the issue of lack of awareness, knowledge, and transparency. It's also the fact that we know, I think it is common knowledge that most of the reports so far have been based on the default values. So we don't know to what extent how it will work, and if importers will really be reporting the real values. And you have mentioned some elements on this, and you mentioned that there will still be the options to report non-default values or default values. So for us, this is a very important element. Then not all national CBAM authorities are at the same level of readiness, and not all CBAM authorities interpret CBAM in the same way. So there we also see, they are not prepared in the same way to control. which is important for the next point on and the next slide, which concerns so one part of the implementation, and then I will talk about the circumvention. So I wanted to say that it's very important for circumvention, the harmonization of the control in different member states and harmonized interpretation. But before that, so we have the lack of data reported, accuracy and overall quality problems, and then some issue that came up more and more, which concerns the fact that there can be double counting and double reporting for the companies, European companies that would be exporting goods that are then transformed outside of the EU and are coming back, or their emissions are taken into account as embedded emissions in these products. And so this is something that really has to be considered as well. And one solution that has been proposed by some of our members would be a full exemption from European installation from the reporting of embedded emissions related to precursors of EU EFTA origin under the CBAM. So this exemption would alleviate the burden of European producers and contribute to a more streamlined and effective implementation of CBAM. Now coming to the next points that are equally important, even more important. So if we can move to the following slide. Thank you. So one aspect that has been clearly mentioned in the Draghi report also is the concerns about the effectiveness and the extreme importance of assessing the effectiveness before, for example, this is what we are saying, not Mr. Draghi, but before enlarging the scope, extending the scope. What he was saying is that we should assess the effectiveness also before we start phasing out the free allocations. And I wanted to mention in that respect also looking at what's happening in the UK, and the UK is proposing a CBAM, but not saying anything for the time being about the phasing out of free allocations. So clearly, effectiveness is absolutely key. We need some thorough and comprehensive impact assessments and proper industry consultations. We need to define objective criteria to affect this effectiveness. And the ambition to replace free allowances by CBAM should be calibrated and assessed over time. Then the following point is another hugely, we stay on the same slide if you can go back. So the second point on the left concerns the export. This is also something that is clearly mentioned in the Draghi report and he's saying that we should revisit the situation and the treatment of exports and clearly explaining how we will have competitiveness problem if we have to pay as European producers 100% of the carbon cost, and then we export our products and we are competing with products that have zero carbon costs. So this is something that has been mentioned and has to be solved before the implementation. And the effectiveness issues has to be solved also before the implementation, before the end of the transition period. For CBAM, so what we are proposing is a WTO-compatible export solution for CBAM sectors to avoid carbon leakage and the replacement of EU low-carbon products with high carbon alternatives on global markets. Thank you. So we can move to the following slide. Now coming to HLB priority number 1, high risk of circumvention of the tool. This is also clearly mentioned in the Draghi report and identified. For us, there is a high risk of source shuffling. So at the source, reallocation of some products with low carbon being exported to the EU, but the average carbon footprint remaining the same. And for us, it would be source shuffling and it would be circumvention. So we need the CBAM regulation, considering that it is very complex and legally uncertain. We need anti-circumvention rules to be strengthened, to be established and strengthened to ensure the effectiveness of the measure and avoid practices such as resource shuffling. And coming to the second point, so after 1 year after the entry into force of the transitional period, some of the AEGIS Europe members indicate issues with carbon footprint data reporting in terms of accuracy, veracity for some countries, particularly, and overall quality. These issues also increase the risk of circumvention and further undermine the efficiency of CBAM. So Europe believes that the assessment of carbon footprint data, at least AEGIS Europe, from the transitional period should be recourse to the expertise of relevant European industry representatives having experience in market trends and practices such as well as products, process, and technical requirements. Thank you. So I think it was the last slide, and I thank you for your attention and happy to answer questions. But there are also people from some of our members in the room. I think Steele is present, and particularly on circumvention, there will be more input. Thank you.
On my right is extreme right, Adolfo Aiello, who's the...
Sorry, extreme right.
That's where you are. Deputy Director General of Eurofer, the European Steel Association. To his left is Aashish Chandorkar, who's counselor at the Permanent Mission of India to the World Trade Organization here in Geneva, focusing on non-agricultural market access issues. And then on my left, very happy to welcome Benjamin Rake, who's Trade and Economic Counselor at the UK mission to the WTO. So I'd like to perhaps give the floor first, because we are in Geneva. It will be really good to hear from diplomats, the perspectives of your countries. Perhaps I want to give the floor first to Aashish for some comments.
Thank you so much, Joost, for inviting me for this session. I can give a perspective on the developing countries, how the developing members in the WTO have reacted to CBAM. I speak here in my personal capacities. The remarks may not represent India's national position. But what I'll try to do is I'll try and bring you the overall summary of what's happening in this area in the WTO, right? So you get a full perspective of what the reactions have been. So firstly, one complaint which the developing countries have had is that the design of CBAM, and when I say CBAM, I mean, unfortunately, we only had one CBAM until last week, but now we have kind of two. So it could be referring to EU right now, but I say this in general as a concept. So one complaint has been that this ignores the principles of international cooperation. Like as Chantal-Line pointed out, there has been a pathway to get to the carbon pricing as an instrument. It did not appear even in the Western world suddenly. There was a pathway to that point. Now that's kind of that policy choice is now being imposed extraterritorially and as a policy measure on the developing countries who may not yet be ready to adopt that particular policy choice. So that's been one of the key concerns. If we go back to the Paris Agreement of 2015, which is the closest we have as an international agreement in this space, that talked about the nationally determined contributions, and that agreement spoke about each country designing its own kind of pathways to emissions reduction or emissions intensity reduction, etc. They were peer-reviewed commitments to be made. Of course, the level of commitment keeps increasing every few years. But the idea was that each country can determine what, how it addresses the climate change issues. So that principle seems to be appended with the whole idea of CBAM, because now, let's say if I wanted to focus on sector X, but now I have to focus on sector of whatever EU or now in this case UK chooses. So that's been there's a fundamental kind of disagreement between the international environment law and the international trade law, which is like what we see in the WTO. And I think that's been one of the primary kind of feedback from the developing world in the WTO committees. The subject is, of course, discussed in various WTO bodies regularly. So the sense that the developing countries get is that there's a bit of a forum shopping here, because when you go to UNFCCC, this is supposed to be a trade measure, but when you come to the WTO, it's supposed to be an environmental measure. So, I mean, it's actually in reality a hybrid of both. And if it's a hybrid of both, then in the ideal world, there should be the concept of a CBDR, or common but differentiated responsibilities, which should have been applied to this kind of a design. So I think that's one of, again, a key point. Then we come to the issue of what are the other policy choices. So, for example, could this be backed with more transition finance, technology transfer, those kind of elements which are more supportive in terms of reducing, abating the problems of the developing countries? I can give a practical example. I mean, we're talking about green hydrogen in a big way. I think everyone in their own capacities is working on that idea as to, one of the inputs or feedstocks for the future for hard to abate industries. But that depends a lot on, say, using the right electrolyzer technology. So if we could expedite the proliferation of that technology, I mean, some of it is covered in the report as well, some of these points which Chantal-Line talked about. So that could be actually one of the ways to address this in a more cooperative fashion. So, or developing countries would then perhaps see these measures in slightly less hostile light if it was also kind of complemented by with some of the supportive measures. But I think these conversations are difficult to have. I mean, for example, we attempted these ahead of the MC13 Abu Dhabi declaration, but obviously they did not progress too well in the WTO context. So this is something to think about where as one of the objections. Another issue which has been spoken previously is about the fragmentation. I mean, today we have maybe 2 CBAMs on the table. When we will have 3, 4, 5 CBAMs, then the type of fragmentation which these systems will bring in will be immense, and it will be especially huge for the MSMEs, because the kind of data you have to compile for measuring, first of all, we don't even know what emissions mean today, like the EU Act, the EU definition for emissions will come up later next year. So each CBAM can have its own standards of what is emission. Maybe someone will follow an ISO definition, someone could follow a World Steel definition, maybe EU will have its own definition of measurement. So we don't even know actually what is the meaning of the word emissions as of today. And when you then apply it into a scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which is like direct and all the indirect emissions plus the transportation, etc., the problem becomes manifold and much more complex. And now if you have to track this for 5 CBAMs or 6 CBAMs, then there is no way an MSME or a small business will be able to make the amount of procedural, operational, and technological investment which is required. They may not be able to justify the exports which they are making for the cost of compliance which they have to bear. So this is something to keep in mind as we go along in the next couple of years, as we see more of these papers coming out of EU and UK. This will be one of the issues which the small businesses will highlight more and more. I mean, perhaps not just in the developing world, but also in the developed countries, because ultimately it's a cost of compliance which everyone has to bear. And so, I mean, some level of standardization of these definitions could certainly be useful. And again, that's not a conversation which is very popular right now. There's also complexity of implementation. So, for example, some of the information which is being collected, some businesses have highlighted that this could be business critical in nature. For example, like latitude, longitude coordinates of a factory, or let's say, gaseous emission profile of a factory. I mean, some of it, like those who are in the steel or in the aluminum industry, you can probably relate to this more. But if you look at a gaseous profile or an emissions profile of a factory, you can actually work backwards on what technology can be potentially being used in some of those in terms of, if they're using any innovative technologies or in any different kind of production methods. So I think that is another concern which industry has, that some of the information sharing, and by the way, this information, like in the EU's case, it will reside with the economic operator, for example, and that may not be like a government entity. It's a private, economic operator, basically, right? So some of the information could lead to sharing of business critical information across. So this is again a design issue which we'll hear more about. The product and the production methods debate, which is a classic WTO problem for the last several years. So this kind of, the design of CBAM will essentially intrude into that debate, and then this can be extended not just to CBAM but to anything, because you can then say that any product could be differentiated based on the production method, which is effectively one of the possible outcomes of this situation. So I will just close by saying that, and perhaps we can take it up in the Q&A as well, some of these international cooperation items as to how we can further this. But I think what is required right now to avoid some of these difficult situations and fragmentation is more trust building. Everyone is working on these problems. It's not that any developing countries taking this lightly. I mean, in many ways, the developing countries get impacted more by some of these issues of environment and climate change. So I think it's not that it's a frivolous conversation. It's just that how do we get together more and avoid conflict and perhaps have more cooperation and more trust? I think that will be the key in the next 2-3 years as these measures evolve. And we look forward to working with our colleagues. I mean, some of us are here, so and we can kind of try to address these concerns directly. But look forward to having some of more like better solutions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Aashish. So let's move then for some comments from Ben, and you are representing the UK, the second in line in terms of having enacted the CBAM. Your reactions. Thank you.
This one? Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say, look, we hear the interest and we hear the concerns, and I think we're very committed to listening and engaging. I suppose where I start though is that, you know, the UK government has been very forward-leaning in our commitments on net zero, and we have a commitment to net zero by 2050. And the new government has put climate, nature, and clean energy at the heart of the programme. So we start from there. We want to do this in a way that, and we are doing this in a way that is in line with promoting trade, because we also think that trade can be a vehicle to achieving global decarbonisation. So I think this is where we're coming from. But I think, you know, the reality is that if we are achieving this objective of decarbonisation, then we do have to address this question of carbon leakage. And that is very, very important. It's very important to the new government. And you would have seen, I think it was mentioned, that we just announced our government response to the consultation. So we are moving forward with it. We are trying to be as transparent as possible, and we do recognise that it's you know, will be of concern to some businesses, to some members, the WTO in particular, where I spend a lot of my time. But we also see it as a really positive thing, and I you know, I don't want to. I think we sort of can recognise the concern while also being clear that this is a key part of our plank of our work to decarbonise the UK economy and the global economy. The best solution would be an international one. I mean, we're really clear about that. So we see, you know, all the advantages of working internationally and multilateral solutions on these issues, but we also are where we are, and we don't have an international solution on the table right now, and we are committed to our climate objectives. So we have to manage this. This is the tricky bit. This is what we have to manage our way through. And what we're trying to do is, well, we're trying to listen. So I think the interesting thing, I suppose, that I would point out is that if you look between what the government announced, the previous government now announced last year, like earlier when we announced it originally, through to the consultation response this week, we are listening and we are making changes. So you'll note that glass and ceramics were in the original UK announcement. They've been dropped because following the consultation. We're also working on the registration thresholds, and we think that over 70% of those removed from the CBAM altogether will be micro, small, and medium-sized businesses. So we know that doing it is not going to please everyone from all angles, but I suppose my kind of plea is to, you know, when we do consultations, when we do ask to talk to people, we do mean it, and we do want to listen, and we are adjusting, we are making changes, and it won't be, you know, everything that everyone wants to hear all the time, but we have this goal of decarbonising the economy, and we are committed to it, and I think this is a key way to do it.
Yeah, stop that.
Great. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to you later on as well. So before I turn to you, it may be interesting to hear the perspective of a specific industry. And Adolfo represents the EU steel industry, which of course is a major target. Steel is a major target of CBAM. Adolfo, your perspectives.
Yes, indeed, thank you. Indeed, steel is the largest sector subject to CBAM. We represent roughly 400 customs codes under the CBAM, so by far the largest. I would say before zooming in the steel perspective, but more on the broader European perspective, I would say that the CBAM should be looked closely in combination with the overall EU regulatory framework. It shouldn't be perceived as a kind of an abrupt summer thunderstorm, but it's rather a milestone of a long journey. You need to consider that the first ETS directive, so the Emissions Trading System Directive, dates back to 2001. So we have had by now more than 20 years of experience of emissions trading system under the EU ETS. Even before the CBAM kicks in, the free allocation is based on very stringent benchmarks set by only the best 10% installations. So 9 out of 10 installations have to buy allowances under the ETS even before the CBAM. Just to give an indicative number, with today's carbon price of 60 euros per ton, if you are a primary steel producer, so you emit roughly 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, you have on average in Europe 5 million tons of production, 10 million tons of CO2 emissions, 20% free allowances shortage, which costs you roughly 130 million euros per year. And this is already before the free allocation phase out of the CBAM. So for the European industry, the CBAM is a matter of extremely high relevance because ultimately it needs to support the huge low carbon investments that our companies are required to do to fulfill the targets. And what we expect in the next few years is first a further increase of the carbon price. All analysts are giving ranges between 100 and 150 euros by 2030. The 55% target for the whole economy is actually 62% for the ETS sectors. So our companies have announced projects whose capital investments are roughly 30 billion euros by 2030. And this is only to stay within steel, but in reality, the overall climate policy is having impacts on buildings, transport, and all other emitting sectors. So it's a real fundamental change of the economy and society, which of course needs to tackle the carbon leakage issue in order to have also some social acceptance. On the details of the CBAM, when it comes to steel, of course, we have first an element of complexity, as I mentioned before, 400 customs codes, different production methods with very different emission intensities, and global trade patterns. Basically, you can import steel to Europe from any country in the world that produces steel. So all this makes the element of effectiveness, governance, very important. So traditionally, the European steel industry has been supporting the European Commission in the shaping of the CBAM, always with a clear and strong caveat about its effectiveness. And I think by now it is still premature to draw a conclusion about its effectiveness. A lot of the conclusions will depend on your work, Vicente, and the collective work of the Commission and member states and Parliament next year. Whether the default values will be effective or not, whether we will have a solution for exports, a solution for resource shuffling. These are all clear topics on which the impact on steel in particular will depend on. But right now, I think going back to some elements that were mentioned before, simplification. Of course, we are, as European industry, we are interested in effectiveness. So as long as simplification makes the system more transparent, more manageable and more effective, that principle has our strong support, but the trade-off should not be against effectiveness. Secondly, about transparency, we believe that the CBAM should mirror as closely as possible the functioning of the emissions trading system. For those of you that do not know it, it's a fairly transparent system where a lot of information about European companies are publicly available. Of course, not the business confidential information. We are not requesting access to business confidential. But the principle should be that any information that is public for European companies under the ETS should also be public for companies that are subject to CBAM as a matter of equal treatment. And then among the other topics, as I mentioned before, the issue of exports is very, very important. One should bear in mind that ETS sectors will be subject to a very sharp decline in cap of emissions. It will be half of the emissions in 2030 compared to 2021, and close to zero or zero by 2040, roughly. So all this requires also effectiveness on the export markets. And last but not least, what was mentioned already before by the AEGIS sectors, all circumvention channels, including the resource shuffling challenge, will have to be tackled by the system, because ultimately what we want is to reduce the global emissions, not only the emissions of the single good that is exported to Europe. Steel is a perfect example of that. Global steel industry represents roughly 8% of global emissions, which is a bit higher than the entire EU. So if we are able to contribute to some important decarbonization of the global steel industry, that should be a joint success. And we are happy to cooperate with that objective in mind. Thank you.
Great, excellent. So rather than giving the floor back to our main speakers, I suggest we collect some questions from the floor. And just to guide you a bit, in my head, I see three buckets of issues to discuss. One is the administrative burden and the call for simplification that I hear both from the Indian SME and the European steel sector. The second bucket, and it's tough to find a balance, is yes, simplification, lower the administrative burden, but CBAM still has to be effective, right? You've collected a lot of data. How can we be sure that this data is correct? So how will verification work? In Renewable Energy Directive, data collection verification has been serious questions, often fraud. How are we going to verify the data that you do get? So simplification, effectiveness, two first buckets. And for me, the third bucket is one of more practical issues, circumvention, the loopholes. So the export issue was mentioned, which to me is a massive issue. How are we going to deal with this? Resource shuffling, downward processing, inward processing. So a lot of more technical instances where we'll have to find solutions. But let me turn to anyone first in the room with questions. And then I know there's some questions also online. And we'll have to use a microphone. Yeah, perhaps, sir, you can go first, and then let's collect a few questions and then turn back. If you want to direct your question to a particular person, do tell us.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I have a particular question.
And perhaps you can very quickly say who you are. Sorry.
I'm Rodmer. I'm a master's student in international law at the Graduate Institute. My question is regarding the next steps toward including more sectors directly into EU CBAM. Is there any, clear schedule for the next steps, for the next phases? For example, in the draft, we had chemicals, but now we don't have included in the EU CBAM. Is there any clear schedule for including such sectors? Thank you.
We saw a hand up over there.
Hi, thank you so much to Joost and the team for organizing this event, and to all the panelists for very interesting and insightful presentations. My name is Tatiana Payosova. I'm a senior associate with Van Bellen Ballas based in Geneva, and working a lot on CBAM, and it's also a topic of my great interest, personal interest. First of all, I would like to thank very quickly Vicente and his team in the European Commission for their responsiveness, because whenever we were engaged with the Commission, asked them questions, whenever it was possible, the Commission was indeed very responsive and provided some support. So thank you for that. I have two quick questions to Vicente and one question to Vicente and Chantal-Line. So the first two questions. First, will there be a report from the Commission on the extension of the EU CBAM to downstream products that is due by the end of this year? And so if when exactly could we expect that report? The second question relates to what you have mentioned on the reporting of the actual emissions. So as we know, until the end of this year, it is possible to report actual emissions either based on the EU methodology or based on the alternative equivalent methodology. So how much of those actual emissions reported are actually based on the EU methodology, if you have that information? And the third question relates to what has been a little bit referred to by Aashish with respect to the standardization of definitions. And I was wondering whether the European Commission and maybe the UNCTAD are looking into comparing the different carbon accounting methodologies and whether they're exploring opportunities for using some type of equivalence with potential adjustments, because I think this is one of the ways to minimize the administrative burden. Thank you so much.
Let's perhaps take two more and then turn to our panelists. Go ahead, sorry.
Alev Mine of the One Goal Initiative for Governance. I'm trying to understand how the investors are involved in the discussions or were involved and will be involved. And in particular, from the point of view of sovereign wealth funds, how UNPRI and IFSWF are sharing work or competing with each other or not. I'm trying to understand if you could eliminate. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Kelly Nyaga. I'm an LLM student at the Graduate Institute with a background in international trade and carbon policy. And my question falls in the third bucket, and it goes to Vicente and to Adolfo. What is the scope for the integration of market mechanisms when we're talking about the CBAM? Is it possible to, and I'd like to get the maybe policy perception from Vicente and the industry perception from Adolfo, is it possible to integrate market mechanisms when talking about CBAM and for industry stakeholders to use carbon offsets when we're talking about the operability of the CBAM? Or is this something that we consider as a loophole to, emissions reductions? Yeah, thank you.
Great. So we already have 4 questions, and perhaps I can turn to you first, Vicente. There was a lot of questions to you, and then Chantal-Line. Yeah.
Very interesting questions. I will try to reply as much as I can. So first, there was a question about the sectors. I mentioned before that we are working on a report for the middle of next year, where in particular we'll be analyzing the possibilities of extending to other sectors. I want to clarify before I come to your question about the timeline. I want to clarify that, of course, the criteria that we will be using for the possible extension of the sectors will be the same, similar to those that we use for the identification of the current sectors. So the risk of carbon leakage, of course, which is linked to the trade intensity of the goods and the carbon intensity of the goods compared with the carbon intensity in the EU. And of course, the other element, which is very important also, is the feasibility. I think you mentioned chemicals. Chemicals, polymers are also intensive in carbon emissions. And I will be transparent. They were not introduced initially because of the complexity with these goods. There is a long list of goods. Well, some of them are already included. Hydrogen, take the case of hydrogen or some fertilizers like ammonia and other products. But the big bulk of the chemicals are not included. And one of the questions was that we needed more time in order to analyze the feasibility and the technicability and the technical possibilities to introduce those goods into the scope. That's something that we are analyzing now. The idea is to come with a list in the report that will be published around July next year. What I can say is that our intention is not to do a big expansion. We need to look at all those elements, because what we want to do, of course, is to really focus and target the objectives. It's not just per se of saying we expand to all ETS sectors, that I think we will do the things in the right way. So we have to be careful about this extension. And then coming to your point on the timeline, what European Parliament and Council agreed is that we should analyze that before the end of the transitional period. This is part of the report. And then, in any case, we should also provide some sort of timeline how those sectors would be included by 2030 at the latest. What I can say is that, and I mean, I can speak for myself, but I cannot speak for the next commission. As you know, the commissioners now are sitting at the hearings, so it's difficult and premature to say. And of course, the Parliament and the Council will have to discuss afterwards, but I don't think that we will be proposing next year to introduce new sectors in January 2026. I think predictability is important, and I think that the sectors need to understand also when they will be in the same way that we did also for the current sectors. Another discussion will be, and I cannot anticipate that, what would be the effect or the effect on, for example, on the free allowances for those sectors. Would they have to be phased out by 2034 at the latest? Would they have the same gradual phase out for the free allowances? I mean, I think that's anticipating too much. But that's what I can say, and that's what we know. But the idea, of course, is to analyze that. And I link to your questions on the downstream goods. Yes, we are also doing the same analysis, whether we will also expand the application of the CBAM to the CBAM goods, to the downstream goods. Just to give you an example, if I'm producing cars which are intensive in steel and aluminum, which are already part of the CBAM, is there an incentive or there is a risk of carbon leakage also with those downstream goods? We are working on that. We launched a study. We are analyzing with our consultant the possible extension to those goods. Again, we are analyzing the extension with the same criteria. And of course, technical feasibility is important. So we need to make sure first that there is a risk of carbon leakage. And second, the CBAM is the right measure to deal with that risk, and then the feasibility. Because if it's difficult, sometimes I mentioned the difficulty with chemicals, but it's difficult with the other sectors. Imagine with downstream goods, where there is a very complex supply chain, where many countries can be involved, where many manufacturers can be involved. I mean, that, of course, is difficult. What I can clarify in any case is that we don't pretend to apply to the production of cars, not to the car itself. What we are talking about here, just to be clear, is about the content of steel, for example, in the production of the car, doors, windows, frames, or whatever. So we're not talking about the whole car. Okay, let's be clear. So the question would be, will we apply this or not to those goods? And your question was about the report. It's true that there is an obligation in the CBAM regulation to come with a report by the end of this year. Honestly, we are reflecting, okay? So it might be the case, but to be honest, I think that what really makes sense is to come together next year, because of course, if we decide to expand to chemicals that will have, or polymers, that will have an impact on the downstream goods as well. So I think that the discussion, the analysis should be taken together, the ones with the other. But I don't know, I mean, maybe there will be a lot of pressure to come with something by the end of the year. In that case, I don't think we will come with a list of goods. Let's be clear as well. So I think that this discussion will come next year, or this analysis will come next year, but in any case will come. So no worries, there will be. And the same goes for some precursors. There are some precursors already in the scope. You know that these are scope 3 emissions. So some precursors also may be included into the scope in order to avoid what you are saying, circumvention in particular. You also had questions about methodologies. If we knew how many companies or importers are reporting with EU methodology or with other methodologies, I will be clear. No, I don't know now. We should know. But the truth is that so far, most of the declarations were based on default values. It's now in October where we can receive more meaningful data based on actual emissions, and that's precisely what we want to analyze now. But since we are still receiving reports, there are some delays, blah, 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 I think that we will have this analysis before the end of the year. So send me an email and I will let you know as soon as we know. or stay tuned and you will hear. Carbon methodologies, different carbon methodologies. I completely agree with you. Again, I mean, someone said, I think you said, I also said, somebody else said that in an ideal world, we don't need CBAMs, we don't need BCAs. I completely agree. In an ideal world, everyone has a carbon price, we all have the same level of ambition with climate policies, and why not? We also have the same methodology, and we need a methodology. Why do we want one methodology and one single methodology? Because we want to treat all goods in the same way. We don't want that one specific country, whatever, because they have their own methodology, which is different from the methodology in the neighboring country. They may have an advantage also in the application of CBAM. We are working with the OECD, you know, this inclusive forum of carbon mitigation approaches. Also, the Climate Club is very much interested in metrics, in aligning metrics. We are very much involved in the discussion. We're happy with that. What I can tell you also is that we are fine-tuning our methodology. We have a methodology, by the way, which has been translated into Hindi, Chinese, Japanese. I don't know if you have already checked because my Hindi and my Japanese are very limited. But if you spot some differences, please let us know that you can already read it in those languages so that can be understandable by everyone. We are fine-tuning that methodology, in particular by listening and learning from the rest of the methodologies. We will do our best, but in any case, we need one methodology. Your question was just for the rest of the audience, because one of the flexibilities was what I mentioned before about using default values during some reporting periods. And the other flexibility until the end of this year, so still for the next quarter, until January, is that you can use your own methodology if you have your own methodology. Imagine countries which have carbon taxes or ETS, they can use their own methodology to report. But by next year, we are asking everyone to use our methodology, not because we want to be, what is the objective, Chantal? A pain in the neck, but because we want everyone to get ready. I mean, the transitional period is a period to learn and to get ready. If we don't do that now, I can tell you, it's like students at school. I mean, I heard that some of you are students, still students. You only study the day before the exam. So this is the same. Well, bad students, sorry, you are not bad students. There were questions about how the investors are involved. What I can tell you is that we have tried to be very transparent and to reach out to everyone. We have many meetings with third countries. Like today, I'm here, but we are in webinars every day. We are, of course, engaging with the EU industry, and I think Adolfo you can confirm that. You can agree with me, even if we may have different opinions on some issues. But I mean, we are trying to, and this is also the advantage of the transitional period, we are trying to anticipate things. And I mention again, and I underline again, that the introduction of CBAM is gradual. And that gives time to investors, that gives time to companies to adapt. We want to give the signal. Listen, this is coming. We are serious, okay? You now have to do your part. If you are considering investing in one technology or another, please go for the greener technology, because not only you will have an advantage with CBAM, but you will be better prepared for the future, because this is the future. The future is not fossil fuels. I mean, Chantal, I understand that some countries are still, in particular some developing countries, still need to rely on fossil fuels, but this is not the future. They know. We need to help them. We are helping them. I mean, and you know that the EU is giving a lot of money. Okay, I don't think the solution is to say LDCs, developing countries can continue being exempting from CBAM, can continue producing fossil fuels, can continue relying on the fossil fuels. This is not the future. This is not the right message. We need to help them. I completely agree, because that will be also for the sake of the whole planet. So the solution comes from one side and not for the other side. And let's be clear, CBAM is addressed at companies, not at countries. We don't exempt countries. Yeah, you will say, yeah, you're exempting Norway, you're exempting Switzerland. We're in Switzerland today. Yeah, but for one very clear reason, because they have the EU ETS, the same carbon price as we have. But we are targeting companies because we know that in India, in China, in Japan, sorry, I don't know if there is a Japanese. I was not looking at anyone. In any country, like in the EU, and Adolfo was explaining the 10% of the best, the average of the best 10% producers for the benchmarks. We know that, like in the EU, there are better producers and worse producers. And what we want to give with the CBAM is an incentive and a reward to those companies who are investing in green policies. So that's the important thing. And the last question was about carbon pricing. Your question about carbon pricing. There is a definition of the carbon price that we can accept under, we can deduct under the CBAM. We are working on the modalities, how this carbon price can be verified. There is also a problem, like, for example, with emissions, which is coming from company level to good level, which is already a difficulty for us, I can tell you. But the question is that we try to mirror our ETS. So we take into account, we accept effective, explicit carbon price paid in the form of an ETS, a cap and trade system, or paid in the form of a carbon tax. And then we can discuss about many different types of carbon taxes. Taxes on the emissions, taxes on the fuels with a CO2 component. I mean, we can be open to that discussion. What we are not accepting is other type of systems that we know that are proliferating and then they're big expanding. And we like the discussion, honestly. We like to be involved in this discussion. Like, for example, Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement on carbon markets. But what we want is to make sure that the systems are integral and transparent. And I'm afraid we are not there. I'm sorry for that. But I'm afraid that some systems which are more voluntarily but not compliance markets, and some systems where the offsets are not really driving a permanent reduction of emissions cannot be accepted. And I have to be cruel. I mean, I have to be clear with that. Of course, the discussion will continue. Those markets will continue improving. I'm not saying this is like this for the rest of the life, of course. But I mean, that's a conversation that I personally I like a lot. I mean, I'm very much involved in this conversation, and that's something that will be continue evolving. But I think it has to be in the context of the EU ETS and also in the context of what we are doing under the Paris Agreement. I know that some countries, and I will stop with that. You're on the roll. Yeah? I told you. If you don't stop me, I know that some countries are introducing carbon pricing. Chantal, you said, we cannot ask all countries and many developing countries. Sorry, it's not personal. You said that many countries cannot, we cannot force some countries who are already struggling with education, health, to introduce carbon pricing. I completely agree with you. Let's be clear. We are not forcing anyone to decarbonize in one or other way. They can do it at their speed as they like. We are just trying to treat in an equivalent manner goods imported with goods produced in the EU because they are all sold in the EU territory. Take the example of VAT or take the example of another tax, okay? And we don't impose any carbon pricing. We can't deduct the carbon pricing because we want to avoid the double carbon pricing. I think that's something that we have to avoid. That's clear. But we can see, Chantal, sorry, we can see, it's not personal, we can see that more and more countries are interested in introducing carbon pricing. It's not only Morocco who is interested. It's not only Turkey who has already announced and will come very soon. It's not only because of that China is enhancing their carbon pricing, and many other countries are doing the same, even discussions in Indonesia and many other countries. Why? Because they realize that by introducing carbon pricing, possibly at a very low level, but that's a good start. First, it will help them to control their indices. Someone mentioned indices. I think you mentioned indices. It will help them to control their indices and to understand their emissions. Second, it will give them some leverage, in particular on the big producers, on the big polluters, to do an effort to reduce their emissions, and that's positive. And third, very important, they get revenues from there, and I hope they will use their revenues to support the greening of their economies. We don't do CBAM because we want to collect the revenues of the third world, or the rest of the world, sorry. We are introducing CBAM for the other reasons you know, but not because we want to get the revenues. So we really appreciate the efforts around the world to decarbonize at their speed and also to introduce carbon pricing.
Excellent.
Thank you. And sorry for the
No, it's fine. Chantal, and
I
then
feel like a punching bag now. I just wanted to say one thing, but I'll say a few more. So basically, you're talking about, first of all, I did not say we should exclude some of these countries. I just said that they should have a choice of the policy mix that they use, and carbon pricing may not be the tool that is the optimal one for now. What do we do about that? And how do you recognize that? Second, you mentioned I worked for the NAFTA before. We gave Mexico 15 years with the NAFTA to adapt to the free trade agreement. Now we're giving them how many months? I'll ask, you can answer later. And these are major structural transformation in their economy that need to happen and major investment that need to happen, right? So, and it's over several months. Third point is, and Aashish mentioned it, in the UNFCCC, there is a principle that you member state of all agree, which is the common but differentiated responsibility. Why? Because these countries, like Africa, as a continent, contributed less than 3% to the greenhouse gas emission. If you compare that to the EU, one would think the EU needs to do more than the African country. So that needs to be reflected also in the speed and the capacity of those countries to be able to adapt to these policies that are being put in our countries. The other point is we can't achieve global greenhouse reduction to 1.5 degrees unless developing countries do it too. We're on the same boat here. We can escape. There's not them and us. We're in the same boat. And yet many of their NDCs, and I'm the one mentioning NDCs, many of the NDCs actually are conditional on international support. Now, the one thing that is binding at the UNFCCC, which we are going next week, I'm assuming, is the NCQG, the new quantified goal. And yet there is a lot of partners that are still sticking to the $100 billion, while we've shown that actually developing countries need in upward of 1.2 to 1.7 trillion, it's also in the report, investment. And renewable energy investment have tripled since the SDG adoption in 2015. We all say we want to achieve the SDGs. Most of that money, actually, a insignificant amount of that money has gone to developing countries. How are they supposed to decarbonize the economy if they can't actually invest in the greening of their grids? So we're not saying there should be a side. We're saying they're with us, but we need to work with the developing countries. And right now, the flow of private investment is not there, and the public support is not there. And there is, and Aashish, you mentioned, I think, the distrust that is being built right now because the money is not there. And because some of these things they feel are going so fast, and this is happening at the same time as the digital transition and the fragmentation of the trade system. So this is not just one thing. Everything is happening at the same time. You're sitting there like, how do I keep up, right? And I think we all in this together, and this is the fear that we have and that I have personally. And I just want to mention also that there is a principle in IPCC on a tiered approach. Tiered approach based on the fact that if you have less capacity, or if you mentioned it yourself, 20% of 80% of the emissions that come into the EU are from 20%. Why would you put so much burden on the small importer, the low volume, or these small countries? It just makes no sense. So what is the tier approach? And then finally, Tatiana, now finally get to your question. One of the coordination that the international organization have talked about is exactly what you mentioned. How can we help with this carbon intensity and coming to some sort of sense? And it could be in terms of a tiered approach that it's not that important if it's 10 ton more, 10 ton less for 100 pound coming from this country. The added cost is not justifying the level of detail and methodology. And so this is where we think the effort should be going into. And I'll stop here, except to say that we have a Baku initiative on climate finance, investment, and trade that we'll be launching on the 14th of November at COP, which is trying to actually bring the finance, the investment, and the trade together. Because as you say, there's no really space to have these discussions. And we hope that that's going to provide a space for these evidence-based discussions.
Great. I think there was also a question to you, Adolfo. As always, we are now running out of time a bit because I want to make sure that my colleagues, Hervé and Yves, have a moment to pull it all together and conclude. So, Adolfo?
Very brief. Vicente was nice with me, so I don't need to answer. Actually, it's just to confirm what Vicente already said. The current system only recognizes explicit carbon pricing. And I think there is a very good reason for that, is because you shouldn't forget that the ETS is a cap and trade system. So the CBAM transfers the cost component of the trade, but we also have a cap component. So the abatement obligation, which is driven by the cap. So if you recognize other forms of carbon cost, you are not taking into account the cap element of the ETS. And just a tiny side consideration about what was said by the panelists about the common differentiated responsibilities and so on. I think it's fair to recognize that, one should take into account that emissions in an overall economy are driven by different sectors. You have transport, housing, industry, power sector, waste. CBAM is only tackling one part of that, which is related to industrial emissions. And within the industrial emissions, actually what we see, even in many developing countries, at least in steel, but I'm pretty sure about the other sectors, actually we are speaking about very comparable levels of development of technology, of economic performance. So I think there is a big difference between the overall decarbonization ambition of societies and the treatment of industrial players in the different constituencies. Because as I said, if you take a European steel company or a modern company in a third country, you will see a fairly harmonized level of technology and development. Thank you.
Okay, I've just been told that we have a lot of people online, and perhaps not a second round of Q&A, but some comments would be very useful. And I know there's another person who wants to come in. Dimitri, if you could perhaps read out the question, or some of them that came in online.
Sure. There've been quite a lot of questions. Some of them, a lot of them for Vicente, understandably. You dealt with some of them in your machine gun monologue before, but perhaps some slightly quick ones. We got a number of questions about what your perception is of the notifications you've received so far in terms of both the quality of the data. You mentioned a lot of them use default values, and what percentage of firms you feel like are submitting notifications this year already. So what the compliance rate is, and I guess whether there's been any opportunity to cross-check it against import data to see if these notifications are apropos. Then just very quickly, a couple of questions on how the CBAM will deal with sort of mixed use cases. So for example, a product that is 80% steel, which is CBAM covered, and 20% something that is not CBAM covered. And similarly, whether firms who have decarbonization projects will be able to claim credit for those if they are not located at the same facility as the good that is being imported. So these kind of split use cases. Those are the questions for Vicente. And then a very quick question for Aashish. Whether if CBAM were done using UNFCCC Article 6 carbon credits instead of the EU's certificates, whether that would be a way to align the EU with the multilateral approach of the Paris Agreement, and whether that was something that would be of greater comfort to you and I guess to India.
Okay, great. Perhaps if you can chip in quickly, a yes or no? I don't know. Sounds like a yes.
I mean, I don't want to comment on India's policy choices here, but in general, any kind of adjustment for what is happening in UNFCCC will give more comfort to the developing countries. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to give you the floor quickly, yes. And then Vicente, you can...
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, try to keep it short. Bernard Lombard, I work for the paper industry. I'm the chair of the CBAM task force in AEGIS Europe. I mean, something that was said also in the slides of AEGIS Europe is that CBAM is probably not the solution for all sectors. Complexity, value chain, there are many things that have to be taken into account. But one thing that is critical is these loopholes we have in CBAM today. We know we are in a learning phase. It takes time. We are all learning. One of the big things is export indeed. And we know that you are going to monitor trade developments, export, and so on. The European Parliament insisted on this. You also said, well, We are serious and we are anticipating things. We try to anticipate things. Are you working on a possible export solution? Because this kind of thing takes a lot of time to prepare. And are you ready to work with us, AEGIS Europe, and Cassidy, the lawyers here? Because we have developed some solutions that are WS compatible. So as we say in French, chiche.
Okay, Vicente, and then we'll have to go to our concluding
very, very quickly, because you need to wrap up. Coming to the questions online, of the audience online, the quality of the data. I mentioned before that there are no verification obligations during the transitional period. So the verification, of course, will be mandatory by an external independent verifier from 2026, because there will be also financial obligations. We thought that during the transitional period, we didn't want to require also the verification. So it's difficult, and I will be completely transparent, it's difficult to say if the data that we are receiving is of high quality, it's completely accurate or not. We trust the rest. Since there are no financial obligations, that's not so important. But of course, if the data that we are receiving, and we are of course analyzing the quality of the data, but if the data that we are receiving is not good, our analysis will not be good in that sense, and therefore we will not learn from that experience. So I think it's in the interest of everyone, and I would like to plea and to make a plea and to really ask everyone to try to be transparent with the data and to provide the real data, which is accurate data, because this will be also positive for everyone. You also got a question about compliance and the gap. What I can tell you is that we have been concentrated we have, of course, be comparing trade data, customs data with the CBAM declarations. What I can tell you is that when we look, for example, at the highest numbers, and that comes again to the question of simplifications, big importance, small importance, what we can see is that there is a very high level of compliance. I mean, I have to say I was surprised, but I was positively surprised. So when you look, for example, at very high levels, take, for example, 1,000 tons per year of imported goods, and now we have already 1 full year, so we can really compare. I can tell you that the number of non-compliance is really negligible. It's very, very, very low. And actually, when we identify some problems, then we realize that the problems were more with the identification in the customs declaration compared with the CBAM declaration. So I think that in that terms, I think, yes, we can say yes. Of course, there is another side. There is another side of the coin, which is with the very small importations. And there, I have the impression that the level of compliance is lower. But that comes again to the same discussion about simplifications, small importations, etc. So I think that that also is an element which shows that, first, very small importers are not really aware of their obligations sometimes. I think I speak a lot, but okay. Anyway, not everybody is listening to me, that's clear. And secondly, some people have problems to comply, and in particular, the very small importations. Think about yourselves. If you buy more than 100, and I don't recommend you doing this, if you go to another country, you are in Switzerland, and you go back to Indonesia, and you find very nice nails or screws, for example, those goods are in the CBAM. If they are above 150 euros, no, it would be the opposite. If you are bringing them from Switzerland to the EU, you need to declare. I bet my hand that nobody is doing that. So there is a clear necessity, of course, need to put into question the 150 euro rule. So that's something we are analyzing. And of course, that's part of the simplifications. Mixed products. I'm not sure I understand the question. The CBAM applies to CN codes. So if a CN code is on our list in Annex 1, then it's within the scope. There are complex goods which can be made, of course, of steel and something else. You only need to take into account the emissions that correspond to the steel. But this is explaining our methodology, so that should not be a problem. Credits, I mentioned carbon pricing, also Adolfo added on that. We receive a lot of questions about, I buy my green electricity from another provider. Okay, I don't want to spend much time on that because electricity and indirect emissions are well apart. But of course, the question is that in order to be able to to say that you are using green electricity, there are some requirements, like, for example, a direct link between the producer of the electricity and the consumer of the electricity, for example, through a PPA or through other means. But of course, there are some requirements that need to be complied. And I understand that many producers are relying on RECs, on GEOs, and I have to say that we have some problems with that. But we are working on that. I mean, we are working on the modalities. That's part of one of the implementing regulations. So next year you will discover all that. Exports, I mentioned that. I'm not going to spend much on that. What I can confirm is that we are working on that. First, analyzing. There will be a carbon markets report 2024. You know, our colleagues in DG Clima, they do that I think every 2 years. So there will be a report by the end of this year that will analyze the impact on CBAM sectors of the phase out of free allowances. So keep an eye on that. That's the start of the game. From that, we will follow up on that. And of course, we will analyze. And then, yeah, I mean, if there is a good rationale, we will analyze. But it has to be, as you said, WTO compatible. Send me your ideas. Okay, I will be happy. I will be happy with reading. And then loopholes. We are looking at a convention. That's, of course, one of the challenges I put on one of the slides. If you remember, resource shuffling, we know the risk. Of course, in the end, the objective is to reduce emissions globally, to reduce the risk of carbon leakage. And these are the parameters that we need to use to analyze the relevance and the importance or the effectiveness of the application of the CBAM. What I can say, because I hear very often, in the end, third country producers, I don't want to mention any country, they will only produce green products for the EU market, but they will continue polluting. That's not the objective. Okay, we will look at that. We will analyze that. But what I can tell you is that thanks to CBAM, we can already see that many companies are introducing green technologies. So overall, we expect that the impact will be positive and there will be a reduction of emissions. But okay, that's something that we will, of course, be monitoring. And someone said that CBAM cannot solve all the problems of this world. I don't pretend. And it's impossible. CBAM is another element, okay? It's another tool that we can use to promote, for example, reduction of emissions, to promote new technologies, green technologies, and to promote carbon pricing.
Okay, wonderful. We are now 3 o'clock sharp, but I want to give the floor for some concluding words to my colleagues, Hervé, Jouanjean, and Yves Melin, who work for a newly created law firm in Brussels, Cassidy, Levy, Kent, Europe, that focuses completely on international trade and sustainability instruments. And Hervé has worked for the European Commission many, many years and has worked with EU industry in particular, preparing CBAM. Yves has worked a lot on CBAM as well, perhaps more with exporters who want to comply with CBAM from that perspective. Hervé.
Thank you, Joost. Well, I mean, it's an ongoing process, so I don't think we can conclude. And I would say that Vicente has perfectly well concluded. So I will say just a few words, general comments. First, I mean, I'm happy after this discussion. Not because I see the lake, which I love to look at when I was in WTO meeting rooms, but because I think that in this room, there has been really a willingness to have a very, very strong dialogue. I mean, we are far from things I heard 2-3 years ago, which were fights about the fundamentals. The fundamentals are there. We have taken commitments at the Paris Agreement, through the Paris Agreement, and now we have to implement them. And so that's the first point. The second point is that the EU approach is seen as an approach which deserves consideration, which has to be discussed, which maybe is an approach amongst other approaches. But I think I've not heard anymore the reference to the word protectionism. I've heard our Indian colleague referring to the NDCs and the way each country can implement its own. I have heard the word extraterritoriality, but at the same time, even the customs duty is extraterritorial because it applies to imported goods. So that was my first general comment. My second comment will be just to take because I don't want to take your time, to take a few words which have been used here, which I think deserve further work. First, simplification. This is really a buzzword here. Second, coordination, which really was also another buzzword. And then I heard also, in connection with coordination, the fear of fragmentation. So all this is a first, I would say, group of words. Second, I have heard the words loopholes, administrative burden, circumvention, resource shuffling, and something very dear to my heart, export. We have worked, Vicente, and we AEGIS, we have given already, and we will give you again our analysis. We are convinced that we can have, that first we need an export dimension, failing what? I mean, the situation of the European industry will be extremely bad because they will not be able to be on a fair ground with our partners. And second, I think we can prove, legally speaking, that it can be WTO consistent as part of a regulatory approach. We could have chosen for the system a pure tax system. The Commission has decided not to do it for reasons which we understand all from an institutional point of view. But this is not a reason why, at the end of the day, because the approach is different from a legal standpoint, the problems on the ground cannot be addressed in the WTO a consistent way. So I think I will stop here because I need to give you time.
Thank you. Merci, Hervé. Yeah, just to the concluding remarks. Just to recall what is the objective of the European Union here. It is to decarbonize production, starting with the EU, and that's what the EU is able to do, is to decarbonize its own economy. We've had the ETS for more than 20 years. The ETS came with free allowances to address a major issue, which is carbon leakage. And it was decided that carbon leakage would be addressed in a different way by the introduction of, so first the removal of the free allowances and the introduction at the border of a CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. And a first comment on this, it looks like while we've been looking at decarbonizing our European production, we seem to be moving towards decarbonizing our own European consumption, right? There's a move there with the CBAM. And as Hervé just said, we opted not to take a tax measure for a number of reasons. One of them is also to lower the ETS, who isn't a tax measure. But it doesn't mean that the EU is intending to regulate what other countries are willing to do. The EU tried for a long time for the dialogue on decarbonization of the industrial processes would be a multilateral one. Remember the COP in Madrid was in 2019. I think it's when the EU realized that what's not going to happen in a multilateral way, so decided to do it anyway. And so we need to remember this. And so if third countries have their domestic concerns and they don't wish to introduce their own carbon mitigation measure, it's up to them. But then the EU must be mindful of the impact that this has on the competitiveness of European industries on those foreign markets. And there are two major issues, I think, with the CBAM that the Commission should address, and the Council and the Parliament as well. The first one is the effectiveness. I'm a customs lawyer, so I help clients facing issues at the border. I'm very familiar about how mistakes are made, the pressure that fraudsters or people who want to cut corners are applying on the declarants. And so we now have a CBAM declarant. A major concern is who tomorrow will be a CBAM declarant? How easy will it be to be a CBAM declarant? And because in the design of the CBAM that we see today, that will be a lot of people. And those people ultimately are responsible for placing the good on the EU market. Listing the CBAM goods that they import, they can already have mistakes there because of the CN codes, and a declarative system, and then you lodge the following year a report. That can lead to lots of abuses if the screening of who can be a CBAM declarant is not effective. And the sooner this is looked at and solved, the less issues there will be, because the issues will accumulate over time, right? You will investigate Olaf, whoever, you investigate the reports after a while. So you need really to look at that. Effectiveness is really key. If it's not effective, if it's possible to fraud for a while, who is going to pay the price is the compliant companies. All the European companies that have to comply with ETS, also foreign producers that are playing the carbon game fairly and won't benefit from that. Effectiveness is a key issue, and enforcement, and there will be a link with the reform of the Union Customs Code that is ongoing. But invite you to really look at that very carefully. And of course, there is the carbon leakage, not linked to the European production that could be located outside of the EU to service foreign markets. And that will not be solved until there is a solution found for an adjustment for exports. The more international the EU industry, the more they need that type of solution. And if you remember your objective, which is to decarbonize production by using our single market as a 20% of the global consumption, maybe you will manage to attract another 30% of global consumption with you. You decarbonize 50% of global production. That's major. So you're reaching your climate objectives by doing that. You are not going to help that if you weaken the European industries. Europe is doesn't lead in many sectors today. Hopefully that will change, but EU is leading on clean energy. And so if you incentivize and you foster production in Europe by companies that are under heavy pressure to decarbonize their processes, while but protecting their competitiveness abroad, you actually reach your climate objective better. That's my concluding remark.
Thank you, Yves, and thank you, everyone. Sorry, we went a little bit over. I think we had a wonderful discussion. I want to thank everyone on the panel, on the roundtable, and you and the audience and people online. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.